So here is Paul determined to return through Macedonia. He was accompanied in verse 4 by Sopater of Berea, the son of Pyrrhus, and Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and Tychicus, and Trophimus of Asia. But these had gone on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. And we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. What is that, the days of unleavened bread? It's a reference to Passover, that's right. We sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread and came to them at Troas within 5 days, and there we stayed 7 days. And on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to depart the next day, and he prolonged his message until midnight. And there were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered together. So we have these pronouns, we and us, that indicates what to us? The author is present. So Luke is here with Paul at this point, right? Verse 9. And there was a certain young man named Eutychus sitting on the windowsill, sinking into a deep sleep. And as Paul kept on talking, he was overcome by sleep and fell down from the third floor and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and fell upon him, and after embracing him, he said, "Do not be troubled, for his life is in him." And when he had gone back up and had broken the bread and eaten, he talked with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took away the boy alive, and they were greatly comforted. But we, going ahead to the ship, set sail for Assos, intending from there to take Paul on board, for thus he had arranged, intending to go by land. And when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and came to Mytilene, and from sailing from there, we arrived opposite Chios. And the next day, we crossed over to Samos, and the following day, we came to Miletus. And skipping ahead, what's going to happen in Miletus? Do you remember? Yeah, this is where Paul is going to interact with the Ephesian elders and give them this stirring address that you see later in chapter 20. We're focusing here on verses 4 through 12 this morning. One thing to notice as we get in here, and I think this ties into some discussions in this class before I got in here, I think when Todd was teaching, there was, if I remember correctly, a question about Paul and others still taking part in some Jewish ordinances even after they had become Christians. I think there was a question that had come up about that. And I think the answer, as was rightly pointed out in those classes, is that you can have cultural involvement with that cultural involvement not necessarily being religious involvement. Just as a practical example, what is today? What is tomorrow? Monday, and then Tuesday, and then Wednesday, and the day before today was Saturday, right? And we will use all of these terms in a cultural sense and think nothing of it. But Brother Roach, as you pointed out, actually all of these terms are reflective of what? Roman gods, right? But you and I, in our culture at large, when we use these terms, does it mean anything religious to us? By saying the name Saturday or Monday or Sunday, are we engaging in any sort of idolatrous practice or lending our worship to false gods? No, sometimes we just participate in something culturally without there being any sort of religious significance to us. But I would have you note here in Acts chapter 20, we notice the days of unleavened bread, correct? But where is Paul on the days of unleavened bread? Where is he? Philippi, right? Isn't that what the text just told us here? We set sail from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. And according to Jewish law, there are 3 feast days where you had to what? Were you expected to be in Jerusalem, and what was one of those? Passover. Passover, Pentecost, and of course I'm going to blank on the third one because Booths is Tabernacles, yeah. Point simply being, where is Paul not here in Acts chapter 20? He's not in Jerusalem, which would indicate to you Paul is not engaging in any sort of religious observance of these Jewish practices. He may be engaging in some in a cultural sense, but if he is being an observant Jew, where did he need to be? He needed to be in Jerusalem, and he was not there, which would indicate to us Paul is not continuing in Jewish religious practices as religious practices after he has come to Christ. Yes, Connie? Sure. Absolutely. All right, so we came to Troas within 5 days, and we stayed there 7 days. So we stayed there how long? Stayed there a week. That's right. You answered your question for today. Whoever answered that, good job, you're done. All right. Let's summarize, or let's just get acquainted in our minds what the timeline is here. He comes to Troas. He's going to stay there for a week. He's going to stay there for 7 days. Paul preaches on the first day of the week, verse 7 tells us. And he plans to depart when? Okay, he plans to depart. Don't skip that. That's actually pretty critical to the text, especially with some questions that we hear today. Paul preaches on the first day of the week in verse 7, and he plans to depart the next day. And so for this reason, what did he do? Because he's leaving tomorrow, right? He's going to preach until midnight, okay? Why were the Christians here in Troas gathered together? At least one reason, the reason the text tells us. They were gathered together to break bread. While they are here in this assembly, what happens? Yeah, Eutychus has been sitting up on the third floor in some sort of observation area. He falls from it, and what? He dies, right? Eutychus falls from the third floor and dies. Paul is going to go down and restore life to him. And eventually, Eutychus is going to wake up, shall we say, towards the end of all of the events here. Paul eats, and he departs after daybreak, which was his stated plan, right? That's why he preached so long, intending to depart the next day. The next day comes, and what does he do? He departs, and he departs at daybreak. All right. So some terms, some phrases, some thoughts here we're going to take some time to dig into this morning. I know the pace of this class in these first couple of lessons you might be thinking, how in the world are we going to get to chapter 28? Are you pulling a Todd or a Travis? I am not. Although I would be in good company if I did. We're going to pick it up after we get through this section, but I think this section, there's a lot of questions about it from our brothers and our sisters in Christ, and this is a text that is often referenced, and I think it's one we would do well to spend just a little time mining. And so we'll try to do that this morning, and then our pace will pick up once we get out of chapter 20. So this phrase here, to break bread, verse 7. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to depart the next day, and he prolonged his message until midnight. Who's reading from the New King James Version? Bill, will you read that for me, verse 7? New American Standard Bible, 1977, goes with we. New King James Version goes with on the first of the week that the disciples were gathered together to break bread. Of course, Paul and his mates here are certainly disciples. I think disciples is probably the better rendering here. It's trying to make some sort of distinction as to the fact that this was the practice of the Christians at Troas, and as Paul and his mates arrive, they are sharing in this practice that was already long-standing there at Troas. And the practice that is being engaged in specifically in verse 7 is what? To break bread, okay? This is not the only time we are going to see this phrase in this text, though, is it? Where else do we see this phrase or a similar one to break bread? Yeah, verse 11. When Paul had gone back up and had broken the bread and eaten, he talked with them a long while until daybreak, and then he departed. All right. Acts chapter 20 just demonstrates to us something that we see very clearly all throughout the rest of Scripture, and that is that this phrase, breaking bread, can carry a couple of different meanings, and of course, we determine its meaning based upon what? Always based upon context, right? When we come across words or phrases that can be used similarly, may be used differently, we always look at the context for the answers. I want you to run through these passages with me. I think they're significant for us to notice, okay? So start back here with me in Matthew chapter 14. Mateo capítulo 14, verso 19. Matthew chapter 14 and verse 19. Ordering the multitudes to recline on the grass, Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up towards heaven, he blessed the food and did what? Broke the loaves, broke the bread. Some translations are going to say there. He blessed the food, broke the loaves, he gave it to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitude. So you've got breaking of bread here. Go one chapter over, chapter 15 and verse 36. Chapter 15 and verse 36. Capítulo 15, verso 36. He took the 7 loaves and fish, and giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples in turn to the multitudes they ate. So Matthew, Mark here, you're seeing these references to breaking of bread in the context of the feeding of the 5,000. This is obviously what kind of meal? Right, and when I say common meal, it doesn't. I'm not trying to say that everything about the circumstances of this meal was ordinary, but this was a meal for what purpose? Yeah, to sustain. It was a meal to sate hunger, to satisfy hunger. You're eating recreationally. All right, that's the purpose here. Look at Luke chapter 24. Luke chapter 24. Lucas capítulo 24, verso 30. Here is Jesus reclining at table. And it says that he took bread and blessed it and broke it and began giving it to them. And their eyes were open, they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. These were the 2 men who were walking on the road to Emmaus. All right. Down here in verse 35, they began to relate their experiences on the road and how he was recognized by them in the breaking of the bread. Look at Acts chapter 2 and verse 46. Hechos capítulo 2, verso 46. Acts chapter 2 and verse 46. Describing the disciples here, day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house. They were taking their meals, King James Version, eating their meat. Is that right? Anyone going to be brave enough to say they're reading from the King James Version? Eat their meat, right. And the Greek word there is trophe, which is literally the idea of actually meat. They were eating their meat with gladness and sincerity of heart. Breaking bread, used just as a way of saying what? They ate a meal, right? They ate a meal. Okay? They were taking their trophe, they were taking their meat with gladness and simplicity of heart. Very end of Acts, Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. Hechos capítulo 27, verso 35, verse 35. This is Paul. This is on a ship. Verse 34, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. So what kind of meal are we talking about here? A meal for sustenance, a meal to satisfy hunger. For not a hair from the head of any of you shall perish. And having said this, he took bread and he gave thanks to God in the presence of them all, and he broke it and they began to eat. What kind of a meal was this? Just what we're calling a common meal here, right? So consistently throughout the New Testament, we see this phrase, breaking bread, or a corresponding phrase similar to it, to reference the taking of a meal, eating a common meal, eating for the purposes of satisfying hunger. Mike.
If you go just one more verse down to 36, it explains it by saying they took food.
They took food, that's right. So sometimes this phrase references a common meal. There are other times where this phrase to break bread is used with reference to the Lord's Supper. Why would the phrase to break bread be used with reference to the Lord's Supper? Okay, right, because that is literally something that occurred in the Lord's Supper. They would have broken bread. Look at Matthew chapter 26. Mateo capítulo 26. Y verso 26. Matthew 26 and verse 26. Here is Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper. While they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Now notice, Jesus does here, at least as the text describes it, just exactly what Paul did back in Acts chapter 27. That is, he took bread and then did what? Gave thanks and then did what? Distributed it. Okay? So just because we see those three things, breaking bread, giving thanks, and distributing it, that doesn't mean that we're talking about a common meal. It doesn't mean that we're talking about the Lord's Supper, because we see those descriptions both of a common meal and the Lord's Supper. So there has to be something more in the context that would guide our thinking. But here is Jesus breaking bread as part of the Lord's Supper. Mark chapter 14 and verse 22 is going to be the same accounting of that, as is Luke chapter 22 and verse 19, same accounting of that. So come over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Primero de Corintios capítulo 10, verso 16. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 16. First Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 16, is not the cup of blessing which we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread which we break a sharing in the body of Christ? Does anyone's translation use a word other than sharing there in verse 16? Communion. This is where you will get biblically the idea of calling the Lord's Supper communion. And as you look at the text in verse 16, with whom are we communing when we observe the Lord's Supper? We're communing with Jesus. Now, is it true that the Lord's Supper in the New Testament is always observed in the context of an assembly? Yes. Okay? And so is there perhaps some connected sense in which we could say we are communing with each other? Perhaps in the sense that we are doing something simultaneously? But make no mistake about it, when our Bibles talk to us about communion, the communion in the observance of the Lord's Supper is not me with you. The communion within the Lord's Supper is me with whom? Me with Jesus. All right? This fulfills then Jesus' statement, I will not eat the bread or drink the fruit of the vine with you until what? I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. When we observe the Lord's Supper this morning, ultimately, who are we eating and drinking with? Jesus. That's what gives what we're going to do this morning in an hour such significance. That you and I are sharing with Jesus. We are communing with Jesus. We are in fellowship with Jesus in a special way in that action. And that action, it involves, verse 16, what? Breaking bread, which simply is a way of saying what? Right, you're taking something, right? You're imbibing something. Look at chapter 11 and verse 24. Capítulo 11, verso 24. Chapter 11 and verse 24. And here is Paul recounting the instructions that were given him by Jesus, which, by the way, back in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, all of these accounts of the institution of the Lord's Supper, who was not there? Paul's not there. So how in the world does Paul learn from Jesus?
He received it from the Lord.
There you go, received it from the Lord. And that's going to be, I think, you've got this 3-year period, 3-year period addressed in the book of Galatians, where Paul is kind of out in the deserts of Arabia. And I think that's where, I couldn't prove that definitively, but that's just what I think. I think that's where Paul is learning, getting schooled by Jesus in these things. Take that for whatever you think it might be worth. But in verse 24, as Paul is relaying what Jesus told him in the observance of the Lord's Supper, that he is talking to the Corinthians about what was one aspect of the observance of that Lord's Supper. What was one aspect of the observance of the Lord's Supper? The breaking of bread, that's right. Was that the only aspect of the Lord's Supper? Nope. But it was one aspect of it, right? It's a common way of speaking. When we talk about human beings, sometimes we don't talk about individuals by name. Sometimes we don't talk about groups of people by name. Sometimes we just call them what? Here's your hint. Starts with an F. Friends. Friends. I'm so honored. Thank you. Flesh. Flesh. Right? And we use flesh. I don't remember if this is metonymy. We use flesh because that is a part of what? A part of humans, and it stands in part for the entirety of a person. Or Jesus would say, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. What does he mean by saying flesh and blood? He's talking, we recognize that he's talking about people, right? Because what do people have? Flesh and blood, right? Is that all that they are? Is that all that you are is just flesh and bones, Julie? No, you're more than that, aren't you? Flesh and blood and bone and nerves and vessels and ligaments and tendons and muscles and all of that, right?
Spirit.
And a spirit, right? There's a whole lot that goes into that. But simply identifying one part that is a significant part of a greater thing is a common way of referencing the entirety, right? Bruce.
I've heard it that, like, when we go out to lunch, like after our service, that we're communing together outside when we go to lunch.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Is there a sense in which we are sharing together? Certainly. My contention is that anytime I see that word fellowship, communion, fellow sharing, and the Greek word from which those terms are taken in the New Testament, it's always with reference to spiritual activities, always with reference to a sharing in biblical things. I'm hesitant myself to use the term fellowship in a biblical sense and apply it to what we might do at McDonald's or Chick-fil-A, even Chick-fil-A, what we might do at any of those places. But I do recognize language and culture shifts, and that oftentimes that term is used, and it's used by some without trying to bring in a whole bunch of things alongside of it. That's just something I'm very careful about. I want to, as much as I can, draw that distinction, that there's a distinction between what we do as a local church, and there's the distinction of what we do as individuals. That's how I would answer that. So we've looked at all of these passages here, and thank you for being patient as we went through them. I think it's important to notice this. But we see that there are times that breaking of bread has reference to a recreational meal, and there are times that breaking bread has reference to communion, to the Lord's Supper, to this memorial act that is done in the assembly. And these are the same, in our English Bibles, these are the same words and phrases in Greek. And so for us to be able to distinguish what's being talked about, what do we have to do? We have to look at a context, right? And the context is going to have to determine that. Okay, back with me here to Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20. So let's talk a little bit about the Lord's Supper here. Does verse, as we're thinking about the Lord's Supper, does verse 6 say anything to you? I don't know that verse 6 proves anything, but verse 6 may speak to something. What happens in verse 6?
Well, he stays there 7 days.
He stays there 7 days.
But he's in a hurry to get back to Jerusalem.
Yes, he's in a hurry to get where he's going, but he's going to stop here in Troas and stay there 7 days. And I realize a lot of this is speculation, but why might that be happening?
In order to break bread with the brethren.
Could it be that he wants to be able to break bread with these brethren? And the response is, well, Brother Roach, he could eat a meal with them at any point during these 7 days. And your response might be what?
He had to wait until the first day of the week to do it with the brethren.
To eat a specific meal.
Yeah.
To have a specific observance with them. What else might this say? What might this tell you about the disciples in Troas?
They might need a little more education.
Okay, they might need a little bit more education. Looking at this, perhaps, how many times was the church at Troas meeting, does it seem? Does it seem like the church at Troas had midweek assemblies? No. Doesn't seem like that. Okay. They might have, but the text here seems to indicate that they didn't, seeing as how when Paul is finally with them, what does he do? He preaches until midnight, right? And everyone's thinking, well, why didn't you talk about this on Wednesday night? And the point is what? Doesn't seem like this congregation had midweek services. Now, contrast that with what we read about the church in Ephesus at the school of Tyrannus where they were meeting, and it seems like they were meeting when? Daily. All right. So, local congregations have the option to do what? To do different things. And to do different things with whose approval? With God's approval, right? If we decided we didn't want to meet anymore on Wednesday nights, could we do that and still be acceptable to God? Sure. If we decided, what if we decided we wanted to meet on Tuesday nights and Thursday nights instead of Wednesday nights? Sure. What if we chose to meet on Friday nights during high school football season? Might not be the best decision, might be creating some artificial conflict there, but could we do it? Could we do it with God's approval? Certainly so. Brother Roach.
So long as you meet on the first day of the week to break bread.
Which is what we're going to get to. Good point.
You talk about context, and this is a simple question. The first day of the week, in this time, is it the same day as it is this?
We're going to get there. We're on the same wavelength again. We're going to get there, I promise. All right, good question. And in fact, it's our very next one. By what method is time being counted here in Acts chapter 20? Jewish or Roman? Now I think this is getting what Mike was asking here. This is an important question. You may not realize this, and this may never come up in your personal studies with somebody, but it very well may, if this has not come up with you before. The Jewish day. Remember Genesis 1? After each day, what was stated? The evening and the morning were the first day. Evening and morning were the second day. Evening and morning were the third day. Why does that sound so awkward to us as Americans? Yeah. Morning starts the day, not evening. But Genesis being a part of the Pentateuch, Jewish books of the law, it's written from a Jewish perspective. Jewish day begins at sundown, let's call it 6 p.m., and it goes 24 hours until the next sundown, 6 p.m. All right, so 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. versus Roman time as we do today begins when? Begins at midnight. And each new day begins at midnight. So both days are 24 hours in length. One begins 6 p.m., roughly. One begins at midnight, okay? Which one is being used here in Acts chapter 20? Now here's why this question is important. If we're using Jewish time, then the observance of the Lord's Supper, as it is here in Acts chapter 20, doesn't occur on the first day of the week. It actually ends up occurring when? On the second day of the week, on Monday, if we're using Jewish time. If we're using Roman time, then the observance of the Lord's Supper happens on Sunday, on the first day of the week. So work through this with me. Remember what we said back here in verse 7? There was something minor in the reading of the text, but it's actually quite important in verse 7. What was Paul intending to do? He is intending to depart the next day. And what does he do in verses 11 and 12? When does he depart?
Daybreak.
He departs at daybreak. Okay? I know it's Sunday morning, but it's 10 o'clock in the morning, so you've had your coffee and it's settled in you for a while. Work through this with me very briefly. That Paul, on the first day of the week, was ready to depart the next day, and indeed did depart at daybreak, necessitates Roman timekeeping that is being used here by Luke and not Jewish. For this reason, if Paul is intending to depart the next day and we are using a Jewish method of timekeeping, Paul can't depart until when? Until after when? Until after 6 p.m. But the text tells us he departed when? At daybreak. Daybreak is a new day under Roman timekeeping, but not Jewish. Okay? It is evident from the text here that we are using a Roman method. Luke is using a Roman method of keeping time, intending to depart the next day, and he leaves the next day at daybreak. In Jewish timekeeping, daybreak is not the next day. It would have to be after 6 p.m. Yes, Julie?
So that's just another aspect of his Jewish behavior that he could decide.
I think that could be a point that you could make, certainly so.
He is in a Roman city.
He is in a Roman, yes, absolutely. It would seem counterintuitive to be here in Philippi in this Roman city and be using a Jewish method of timekeeping. Jamie?
But doesn't that present a new problem if they don't break bread till after midnight?
Well, that is a wonderful question, and I'm glad you brought that up, Jamie. Let me work through a couple of things and get there, all right? We're calling this book not the Acts of the Apostles, if you'll remember, but the Acts of whom? Nope. All the way back to lesson 1. I know you remember every word that ever comes out of my mouth. So, the Acts of the risen Lord. Remember, Jesus is the one who's choosing the next apostle. Jesus is the one sending the Spirit. Jesus is the one who is in back of all of this. So as we're looking here at the Acts of the risen Lord, the Acts of the risen Lord would indicate that the Lord's Supper is to be observed when? When did disciples, with the sanction of an apostle, observe the Lord's Supper? Acts chapter 2, that's all happening when? On the first day of the week. And it seems here, although Jamie, you were right to bring up the question about breaking bread and how it's used also in verse 11 and verse 12, which comes after midnight. There's a question there. But it seems as though they are observing the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. Now, simply with that being said, I would pose this question to us. What practice do we definitively know is right and proper and authorized regarding the observance of the Lord's Supper? What do we know? What can we see people doing in Scripture with the approval of Jesus that we can, as we would say today, take to the bank because we can have absolute certainty in it? Observing the Lord's Supper upon the first day of the week. We can do that with absolute confidence, right? Because that is the pattern that we see playing out in the New Testament. Alternatively, what practice can we have no definitive confidence in? Observing the Lord's Supper on any other day. Now, Jamie, this brings up the question you posed to us. Does chapter 20, that shouldn't say its, it should say acts. Its makes no sense there. Does Acts chapter 20 and verse 11 indicate an observance of the Lord's Supper on a non-first day of the week? This is your question, correct, Jamie?
Well, I'm just saying if we're going on.
Right, I'm not saying that this is your belief, right. This is, all right. Jimmy, you couldn't give me a couple more minutes? Come on. Larry was nice to you guys. I got 5 more minutes. Yeah, Jimmy, I got 5 minutes. Okay. Let's look at chapter 20 and verse 11. And when he had gone back up, who is the he in verse 11? Paul, okay. When Paul had gone back up and had broken the bread and eaten, he talked with them a long while until daybreak and so departed. All right. In chapter 20 and verse 11, who is eating? And I think that's important to notice. Number one, in chapter 20 and verse 11, the only one who is mentioned as breaking bread in this passage is Paul. He. When he had gone back up, and he had broken the bread, and he had eaten, he talked with them a long while until daybreak, and so he departed. Who is breaking the bread and eating in verse 11? It's Paul. Okay? And I think it's also important that Luke notes for us this unique phrasing. Paul did what? What did Paul do in verse 11? Okay, put it together. He broke the bread and ate. He broke the bread and ate. Eaten. The word that is translated eaten here is a Greek term that is never used with reference anywhere else in the New Testament in connection with the Lord's Supper. It is a word that is consistently used with a reference to what kind of breaking bread? Recreational meal. A meal for sustenance. Right? But it is never used, unless Acts 20 and verse 11 is the exception, it is never used with reference to the observance of the Lord's Supper. Because the Lord's Supper is not a meal intended to do what? To nourish, to satisfy hunger, right? That's not the purpose of it. The word translated eaten is never used with reference to the Lord's Supper. Look at a few of these passages with me, okay? I know that's super small, but I wanted to get this all on one slide. Look at Matthew chapter 16 and verse 28. I got to run through this, Bill, all right? I'll come back to you if we got time at the end, all right? Matthew chapter 16 and verse 28. Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here today who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Here is a metaphorical use of the word eaten. They will not taste death until they see the kingdom come. Look at Matthew 27 and verse 34. Matthew 27 and verse 34. "They gave him wine to drink mingled with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink it." Mark chapter 9 and verse 1. "Truly I say to you, there are some of those standing here today who shall not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come with power." Again, that is that metaphorical use. John chapter 2 and in verse 9. John chapter 2 and verse 9. When the head waiter tasted the water which had become wine and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom. Chapter 8 and verse 52, John 8 and verse 52. Surely you, verse 52. Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died and the prophets also, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never taste death. Acts chapter 10 and verse 10. He became hungry and was desiring to eat. But while they were making preparations, he fell into a trance. Chapter 20 and 11, which we've already read. Chapter 23 and verse 14. Acts 23 and verse 14. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. As you are... 30 seconds, Jimmy. As you are looking just simply at how Luke uses this term in Acts, it is always used with what kind of eating? Recreational eating. It's never used with reference to the Lord's Supper unless chapter 20 and verse 11 is an exception. That doesn't make a lot of sense, though. When the consistent testimony of Scripture all throughout is this word always means the taking of food with the idea of tasting or sustaining. So for all of those reasons, particularly because Paul is the only one eaten in chapter 20 and verse 11, the conclusion I come to based on the text is that this is not the Lord's Supper that is happening. The Lord's Supper observance was happening back in chapter 20 and verse 7. Okay. We're done. I want you to finish reading chapter 20 for next Sunday, okay? Finish reading chapter 20, and we'll pick up with Paul's address to the Ephesian elders. Appreciate your attention this morning. Thanks. Thank you, Jimmy.